Thank you all for coming to tonight's presentation by John Seed about a little-known Armenian artist practicing in Hawaii, Arman Manookian. John is a very good art historian and researcher, so you'll be treated to a lot of information that shows that he knows where to get the information about his subject. John is a professor emeritus in art and art history at Mount San Jacinto College. He's written about art and artists in many forms, print and online publications, including Hyperallergic, Huffington Post, and Sotheby's Asia. And he's also written books, including the one about Arman Manookian and the back on the table, and the title Disrupted Realism, Paintings for a Distracted World. So, John, thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Associates of Brand Library and Art Center. I'm the president. My name is Deborah Thompson. And our treasurer, Deborah Burchett-Lear, is the person who brought John to our notice and who encouraged him to join us tonight. So thank you, Deborah. She's sitting back there at the back door. This is made possible through the membership of the Associates and through sponsorship, particularly by the Glendale Arts and Culture Commission, who sponsored us very generously for programs in association with Brand 50, which is the exhibit that you see in the gallery. It's the 50th anniversary of our juried national shows. So if you get a chance at the end of the presentation, take a look at it and enjoy. So, John, come on up. Thank you, everyone.
I'm just going to say briefly that I want to thank the brand associates, especially Deborah and Deborah. And if you haven't met them, Deborah Lear and Deborah Thompson both had a part in the invitation, and I'm honored to be here. And also, it's a really nice feeling that I think 2/3 of you I know already. A lot of friends are here, and to my friends, I am, and my family, really, really touched that you're here. People who I haven't met, I hope we leave friends tonight. But thank you for your interest in the presentation. I can get going. You know, I'm a former teacher. You'll see me you'll see the gears start to turn and it's going to begin to go fast, but I want to start slowly. I want to do that purposefully. I'd like to tell you how this story came to me, because the story of Arman Manookian's short life it's a very touching, remarkable story with a lot of great locations. So this is how the story came to me. 25 years ago now, I was in San Juan Capistrano, California, and I like to do what maybe some of you like to do. I like to go into thrift and antique stores thinking I just might find a lost Leonardo or a Picasso that got left at somebody's house by accident, you know, things like that. Sometimes I look, Antiques Roadshow style, I look for things. And at this antique store, I bought a Philippine painting for $150 that I just thought was a good painting. I thought, this is good quality, you know, I like this painting. I sold it on eBay, and my total profit was about $50. So this wasn't a big deal. However, the man that bought it, after he paid for it, told me, he said, I'm a private art dealer. And, you know, it interested him that I was a professor, it interested him that I had this taste in art, and he said, I'm going to put $1,000 in the mail. And this is, I just traded email with him. I'm putting $1,000 in the mail and some clippings. And I'd like you to do research on Arman Manookian, because he was from Hawaii originally. He was a naval commander stationed at Pearl Harbor. He said that in Hawaii, Manookian is famous, but on the mainland, nobody knows him, and that there were big gaps in what was known about him. There were just some newspaper clippings and a lot of empty space. So he sent me this clipping from the Star Bulletin and a few other clippings and a more recent clipping. And I took the $1,000, and I thought to myself, this is a nice, easy way to earn $1,000. I'll work on this for a month, I'll do a short article, I'll send it to a magazine, and this will be a nice experience. But then a year and a half went by. And what happened was, I couldn't kind of crack this story. I couldn't find much more information. It wasn't going anywhere, but it was the beginning of Google. It was the very, very early years of Google, and I went to an event where somebody said, have you heard about this new search engine? You know, you should try it. So I went in and I tried all these variations of the name Manookian, and with it spelled with a U, O-U-K-I-N, I found a man in the city in France where letters from a long time ago said that Manookian's brother had gone. Then I found a chess club and I found that this man was a member of a chess club, and I found the president of the chess club. And this is where the story's going. So a French-speaking friend called, and got the cell phone number of Patrick Manookian, who was Armand's nephew. And with that friend I called, we got him on his cell phone, driving to Paris. And when we got him, there was a big silence on the line, and then he said, "Nobody has talked about my uncle for decades. How the hell did you get my cell phone number?" and there was some discomfort and some hostility, because this is about a story that goes back to the Armenian Genocide. It's about a suicide. It's about a tragedy in a family. It's about a lot that you would want to leave behind. And why was a non-Armenian interested? There were a lot of questions. But anyways, the family was interviewed, and suddenly the story really came alive. And with their help, and then with more research, if you've done research, you know that one thing leads to another. The way it opened up, I now have a much more complete story. And it led to a feature article in Honolulu Magazine. It also led to an article in Yerevan that Nere, who's here today, helped publish in 2011. So I have another, Manookian content. It led to a number of articles. But now that I've told you the background, now that I've told you how Google kind of cracked this open, let me tell you the story and tell you what I learned. So Arman Manookian lived in this incredible multicultural city, and here's a view of the Bosphorus from the late 19th century on a postcard with the Hagia Sophia in the background. Ancient city that goes all the way back to Byzantine times, and grew up in a wealthy, Europeanized family, a very, very literate, well-to-do intellectual family. And the context, if you try to imagine what was Constantinople like, what was it like to live there or to grow up there, I'm just going to give you an anecdote or two. Until 1909, the Sultan that was in power there had a phobia about electricity. And he didn't allow telephones or trolley cars or electric lighting in Constantinople. When the Young Turks came in, that began to change. But imagine that. Here's another thing about Constantinople. There were no addresses. So that the people delivering the mail just got to know the families' names and would ask around to deliver the mail. So it's a town, it's on the verge of modernity. It's going to lurch into modernity in a very painful way, but it's kind of a living Byzantine / Islamic metropolis at the same time, one of the great and most beautiful cities of the world. And here's a few photos that take you back, and also more information that came my way. Manookian's grandfather, get this, he was a merchant who traded in Manchester and Marseille. And he was British educated, and then his son Arshak, who was, by the way, Armand's childhood name was Tateos, or they called him Tadi, T-A-D-Y. Arman is the name he took in the United States, so just clarifying that. But anyways, Armand's father, Arshak, was Oxford educated, an attorney. And his wife, Agnes, Armand's mother, was the daughter of a publisher of Bibles. And they were Armenian Protestants. So anyways, an extraordinary family. And I found these photos to take you back. An Armenian boy with his mother. Maybe that's what Arman and his mother might have looked like. And a newspaper office. There were many newspapers in Constantinople, and in many different languages. And I'm gathering that the Manookian family was multilingual. Speaking French, Turkish, Armenian, probably some English as well. So highly literate, highly educated family. And it's still standing. St. Gregory the Illuminator Church. Arman and his brother Vahe were choir boys at this church. So this is where they went to church. And I discovered, this is where it gets remarkable, this was the principal of their school. The principal of their school, Daniel Varugin, is now considered a leading poet of Armenian past. And he was also what you would call an Armenian nationalist. He was trying to generate a renaissance in Armenian culture. And you can see how his views would be threatening to a non-Armenian, because he says that without the Armenian spirit, there is no Armenian literature and no Armenian artist. Every true artist expresses his own race's spirit. But he was Mekhitarist educated. He'd been educated in the city of Venice. He was the principal of the school. And I try not to stumble when I tell you these things, but I'm going to try. He was skinned alive in April of 1915. Anyways, going back a little bit. 1909, this is the front page of the New York Times. This is kind of the world view of the change when finally, the Sultan was gone in Constantinople, and, Ataturk and the Young Turks took over. I think the world looked and saw, well, maybe this, decaying organization, this decaying political system is gone. Maybe there's progress and modernity for Turkey. And of course, well, there was, along with tragedy. And Arman would have been 8 years old when this photo was taken. He apparently grew up fascinated by the ships in the harbor. I mean, that's natural for growing up in Constantinople. The Great White Fleet that Teddy Roosevelt had put together didn't stop in port, but they did go by at one point. And this is a converted yacht that was a US naval vessel called the Scorpion that was there in the Bosphorus. And apparently the family still has drawings of ships that he did growing up. That was his first artistic expression. And of course, he loved ships, and ships relate to transportation and seeing the world and a bigger world. It was already a very, very troubled place. I'm sure many of you know that the first Armenian massacres, well, there had been several series of massacres. There were serious massacres in 1909. There was always pressure. I mean, when you go all the way back, you find that until the middle of the 19th century, the Janissaries, who were the private army of the Sultan, could cut off an Armenian's head in the street just as a show of power, as a show of authority. So the history that, again, I'm sure many of you know, just shy of Tateos, later Arman becoming 11, 200 important leading men, intellectuals, writers, politicians were gathered up and imprisoned. They met a variety of fates. Some were executed, deported, tortured. Don't know to go to detail of the list. But Manookian's father and uncle were spared because they had this large newspaper office, and they hid in the printing machinery, they hid in the print factory, and survived. So, of course, this whole period had extraordinary trauma that everyone witnessed, but his father survived. However, after his father and uncle escaped and left for France, his father died of the Spanish flu in 1917. So I'm going to say that essentially, he probably didn't see his father after this period. His father had to leave for France, and then his father died when he was a young teenager. So there's call it a father-shaped hole in his heart. So in 1920, Manookian's mother, Agnes, gave him a large sum of money, because he was the oldest son, and she wanted a future for him, didn't see it happening in Turkey. And he took this ship, he took the Re d'Italia to Ellis Island. And when he arrived, here's a picture of Armenian immigrants at Ellis Island. They came, I think, I'm sure with excitement and also with some fear and a bit of shame to the United States. I know I've learned reading about Arshil Gorky, who, by the way, he had an Armenian name. That was not his Armenian name. He took the name of a Russian poet to kind of pretend to be Russian. But he was embarrassed enough about being Armenian that his first wife didn't know he was Armenian until they had divorced. Because Armenians were seen as refugees and poverty-stricken and all of this. So there was shame about being Armenian. But he did take the name Arman when he came to the United States. He briefly lived at the YMCA in Providence, Rhode Island, but he had been sponsored by some relatives who had an umbrella repair business. And he lived with them and began to attend school. Just to say something more about the situation of Armenians, this is all, after World War I, it was a tough economy. There was, you guessed it, a great bias against immigrants, as taking away employment from other Americans. And the largest employer of Armenians in this period was the Hood Rubber Plant in Watertown, Massachusetts, which later became, and this tells you something, a Superfund cleanup site. But that's, the kind of job that many Armenians did. Because his family had owned a newspaper, I think it was always his ambition to be a newspaper illustrator. And in fact, his brother became a professional lithographer in France. So he got a scholarship in illustration and drawing to the Rhode Island School of Design and excelled there, did very, very well, picked up quite a bit of training. And also it was a period where you could attend the Art Students League in New York just class by class. You didn't have to have an admissions process. It wasn't hard to enroll. So you apparently took life drawing and a variety of classes also in New York. And then that's the first photo I have of him with the Marine shaved head and the jug ears. And he was a short man. I think he was 5'3" or 5'4". But that's the boot camp photo of Arman Manookian in 1923. He wrote to his mother that he had joined the Army of the Navy. That's how he described, the Marines. That was a good way to put it. And he had a bit of good fortune when he joined the Marines because he met this man, Major Edmund McClellan, who is a descendant of the Civil War General McClellan. And he was a very fine historian. And he was working on a history of the Marine Corps that unfortunately was never later published. It was an 800-page history. And he saw Manookian's illustration skill and said, "I'd like you to illustrate the book." So from the McClellan estate, I actually got a lot of paperwork from them once I connected with them and began to do my research. There's the paper, April of 1925, after about a year and a half of travel, Manookian petitions to be made, the assistant to McClellan and to be stationed at Pearl Harbor. And I know I want to respect, yesterday was Pearl Harbor Day. With the 81 years from Pearl Harbor, we all think of December 7th, we think of Pearl Harbor and the tragedy. But Pearl Harbor to Manookian and to the other men of his era was paradise. It was the best possible military assignment you could find. There were letters, he was thrilled to be there. So he began doing historical illustrations for McClellan, and he also did illustrations for Leatherneck, for the Marine magazine. And you can see how developed his skill had become, the kind of line work that went into lithographed publications. And I really like this side by side because remember, he went to the school of St. Gregory the Illuminator. And you can see how in his spirit, there was something that had been building in him for a long time to be, like a scribe, a fine artist or illustrator. And you can see how that relates to this tradition. But that was a tiny, it's like a little 2-inch wide illustration that I found in the margins of a Leatherneck that he probably put there. Maybe the boss didn't know he was putting that in there. The archive, most of the original drawings that he did for McClellan eventually got donated to the Honolulu Academy, so they're there if somebody would like to study them, and you'll learn a lot about military history. And he had an especially good time talking about how the Captain Cook, not marine history, but that's another thing he illustrated, was Captain Cook coming to the Sandwich Islands, which were later the Hawaiian Islands. But in 1925, what was Honolulu like? Well, here's a few things to think about. Manookian's time in the Marines to the end of his life roughly corresponds with Prohibition. So officially, Honolulu should have been dry. Not at all. And Honolulu was a town of speakeasies and prostitution and fast money and fast talkers and all kind of colonial exploitation. And I think one of the interesting things I began to realize about Manookian the more I studied him is that he had come from a kind of a subject people in a port city, and he later empathized with the Hawaiians who were a colonized people in a port city. And interesting how that played out. But again, what was it like to be stationed in Pearl Harbor in 1925? Take a look at that Navy seaplane towing surfers. I don't know if the commander authorized that, but again, what a place it must have been. And when he got asked to do the cover for the Christmas issue of the Pearl Harbor Weekly, I don't think he strictly went historical. He's got a couple bare-breasted ladies with a happy sailor. It's fairly racy. So he was, he was loving it, and he wrote back to his friends and family that he, couldn't imagine a greater paradise than Hawaii, and he couldn't imagine why every artist in the world didn't show up there sooner or later. I want to say something about travel, because this was the era where, yes, there was military air travel, and there were some seaplanes, But it actually wasn't until the early 1930s, until Manookian had passed away, that there was regular air service to Hawaii. So people came on the boats. And I found this photo, even though it's after Manookian's death. In 1939, if you wanted to fly from San Francisco to Honolulu on the Pan Am Clipper, it was a 25-hour flight. So probably a luxurious, bone-rattling, deadly boring flight, right? But still, you know, if you got there, if you had the time to go to Hawaii and you had the time to spend there, Waikiki was, you know, bristling with people. A hotel where some of you may have even stayed, the Royal Hawaiian, bright pink, you know, flamingo pink, Florida style, opened in 1927. So, you know, Hawaii was transitioning into a new kind of tourist culture. And in that year, in 1927, a couple things happened. Manookian got his first newspaper job because of the work he'd done for Leatherneck. He began working part-time for the Star Bulletin, and he joined the Artists Association at the Honolulu Academy. And he heard a lecture. One of the first things he heard was a lecture by a visiting French woman art historian, Madame River. He heard all about Gauguin. So when people say to me, oh, was he influenced by Gauguin? Absolutely, absolutely. And I found this clipping from October of 1927. And boy, nice new projector. Brand Library, you're doing a good job, but there you can read it. Becomes a US citizen on October 20th, 1927. A very proud moment. And just saying something about artists in Honolulu. No, every artist in the world was not there. But there were some well-trained and some skilled and some interesting artists. For example, Jules Tavernier, who also worked and lived in San Francisco, was a volcano specialist. So if you were an upscale tourist, maybe you took home, you know, a volcano on the Matson liner. D. Howard Hitchcock had a downtown studio where you could watch him paint and take home, you know, some sugar palms or maybe a Hawaiian hut. And then a very popular artist, John Melville Kelly, was an artist illustrator who worked at the Star Bulletin with Manookian, became a very close friend of his, and he was famous for his, you know, menu covers, and he did programs for the Matson liners. He, in some ways, kind of established the Hawaiian style for posters of the 1930s and the 1940s. So Manookian began to exhibit his work, and the striking aspect of his work, the thing that people talked about immediately, was the color. Now, if you know a little bit of art history, you certainly know that in Europe, you know, the Fauves and Matisse had come along and had used out-of-the-tube, brilliant, you know, coal tar synthetic colors. But still, let's say in the American art scene, it wasn't as accepted. I remember hearing Georgia O'Keeffe talk about the fact that to compete with male painters, she had to paint duller and duller and grayer in the 1920s. But Manookian's color was Byzantine. It was like the colors of the mosaics that he must have seen growing up. So his Tropicalia drew both, you know, admiration and I'm sure some snide comments in 1927. He had a friend named Arthur Green, who was another newspaper man, and they liked to hunt, or excuse me, not hunt, but they liked to hike on Manoa Falls. And I want you to take a look at the color in this picture, the blues and the grays, and then I found a kind of a similar, you know, photo. The green really is that verdant, right? In a way, the color of Hawaii didn't have to exaggerate. So in the Star Bulletin, a Manookian became a kind of a personality. Not that he didn't have a column, but he sometimes had illustrations, and everybody began, you know, as an Armenian, he stood out. And here he is, there's a little bit of banter he's having with a man named Don Blanding about, you know, who would wear red knickerbockers? And Don Blanding says, well, that person would have to be crazy. And Manookian says, you know, well, Santa Claus gets away with it. So he was becoming somebody that people knew and talked about. And I'll say something about Don Blanding. And if you love research, obviously I love research. I go into Manookian. I'd love to learn more about Don Blanding, but he was an author, an illustrator. He had kind of an Art Deco, you know, illustration style. He wore a blue lapis ring, and he was an early critic and kind of a defender of Manookian. He related to, you know, what Manookian was doing, and he did write newspaper criticism and support it. So when he wrote about Manookian's work in 1928, he had some praise. He's defending the color. Strong, vibrant color, which is not garish, fantastic abstract form, which yet conveys its subject superbly. Dramatic composition, which arrests and excites attention. These are the qualities of his work. So that is a really, really nice boost to get from a friend, fellow artist, and critic. Manookian did numerous sketches, including some sketches of the sugar mills, the boats floating in the various harbors, and again, you can see all that training and that ambition to make newspaper illustration. He also began making illustrations for Paradise at the Pacific, which was a very, very famous magazine, kind of like the Life magazine of Hawaii. And even after he died, they recycled and reused a lot of his images as colors. It's another way that Manookian became known in Hawaii. In fact, here's one. It's a gouache painting he did that 6 years after his death, it appeared in color in Paradise at the Pacific magazine. By the way, people often ask me, and I'll talk about this at the end of the presentation, where can you see a Manookian painting? It's pretty hard to do. But there is this one that I think was made for Paradise at the Pacific, and a gentleman on Facebook sent it to me. He said, here I am with a Manookian. It's at a place in Honolulu called the Pacific Club. That's one of the few public paintings that I know about. Kind of an Art Deco image. He got interested in the myths and the stories of old Hawaii. So here's Maui snaring the sun. And by the way, he liked Greta Garbo, and I think it shows. You know, so there you can see that this little sketch that he published in the Star Bulletin has that kind of Garbo-esque glamour grafted onto what should be a Hawaiian woman, but doesn't look particularly Hawaiian. Looks like a flapper. Continued to make these kind of bold, simplified, modernist paintings, sometimes a little bit of cubism, often drawn with a grid underneath, because he was very, very careful about the way he laid out his compositions. A shoreline where the view, I found some photos of the view, is still very similar in this wonderful place, Aliwai, but you can see the fishing huts up on piers coming out of the water. So here's where I've kind of expanded my talk. I know I have a few people here that have heard the talk before. I've been trying to learn about Manookian's patrons. It interested me to, who would buy these paintings, who took an interest, what really launched his career, and I have more information now to tell you about the people that patronized Manookian and his art. So the story goes that one night in 1929, two society ladies attended a show at the Hawaii Theater, which is still there. And the Hawaii Theater, there's a picture of the interior. It has a Lionel Walden, it has a neoclassical mural up above the proscenium. So I give that to you for context. The ladies had been in this fabulous theater. They'd been surrounded by a more traditional kind of art, neoclassical art. And they came across the street to the Green Mill Grill. And the Green Mill Grill was owned by a Greek, and it was full of 6 incredibly bold and brilliant Manookian murals. And I'm going to go maybe off script for a minute. I'm going to tell you what I think was going on. The Green Mill was owned by a man named George Gerasimos, and I did get to interview his daughter, who's passed away since, but she was still alive. And she said it was a speakeasy. Manookian loved to drink, and he probably traded drink and meals for the murals. And also, he and George Gerasimos had something in common, which is they both really hated the Turks. So they had something to talk about, and they were fast friends. But anyways, that's a little bit about the Green Mill Grill. And you can see in the Star Bulletin here, I even found a clipping on October 5th, 1929, when he finished the murals. It made, a news item in the Star Bulletin. And one of the panels actually appeared in a sketch and gave a little bit of information about the Green Mill Grill. Maybe that's what brought the ladies in. Maybe normally they wouldn't have gone there. But here are the ladies, and they're very, very interesting. Muriel Colgate Damon, and I know what you're thinking. Yes, the toothpaste family on one side. She also is related to Jackie Kennedy. She's related to the Auchincloss family on another side. But she was an East Coast socialite who married into a missionary family. The Damons had been in Hawaii since 1842. Her father-in-law was the 4th largest private landowner in Hawaii. So she was a very wealthy lady. But then much more wealthy was the lady that she was spending time with, Helene Irwin Crocker Fagan. She was the daughter of a sugar baron, and I want to tell you something about her father, Mr. Irwin. Mr. Irwin was the business partner of Klaus Spreckels. And you hear that name, probably you're thinking sugar. You know, he was a sugar baron. And the story goes, I'm going to go sideways a little bit and then come back, that Mr. Spreckels once won 3/4 of the island of Maui in a poker match with the king of Hawaii. You want to talk about colonial exploitation. So the way he became wealthy, I think, is not entirely kosher. But anyways, she was one of the wealthiest women in the United States because of her father's fortune. She was the only daughter. And she had married into a member of the Crocker family. She married a man named Templeton Crocker. And in fact, I'll say something about Templeton. This is their home. Their home is still there in Monterey. It's near the ghost trees, if you've seen the ghost trees. It was completed in 1929 for a cost of $2.1 million, which, what would that be, 40 or 50 million now? 2-foot thick concrete walls with 8 inches of stone from Mount Vesuvius on the outside. But here's the interesting part. It was Byzantine. They loved and collected Byzantine art. And when it became clear that her husband loved opera and other men more than he loved her, they divorced, and she married a banker from San Francisco named Paul Fagan. And the Fagans established a ranch on Maui on some property that came from the Irwin family. So these are, and there's so much more to tell you, such interesting stories, but those were the patrons, those were the ladies that came into the Green Mill Grill and said, we'll take all the murals. Story goes, they bought everything they saw and then they divvied it up. And here's some black and white pictures from the 1930s at the Fagan Ranch. Now the Fagans had a very famous hotel, the Hana Ranch Hotel, and then near that famous hotel they had their own private ranch house. So the Manookian paintings were in the ranch house, but some of them later made their way into the hotel. So from the 1950s I found a photo, let's see where, you can see in the lobby, there's a Manookian painting there. And I understand a whole lot of young Americans had their honeymoons in the Hana Ranch Hotel, especially when airfare became more affordable. So that's another way that people learned about Manookian and got a reputation. So I'll show you some of these paintings. And I kind of want the paintings to speak for themselves, but here I am with a microphone. Manookian thought of himself as an illustrator. But I think that what happened is that in Hawaii, I think he became an artist. I think he crossed the line and he became something else. So they are, carefully drawn, and they do have a storytelling and illustrational quality, but the way he used color was really quite extraordinary. So I think Hawaii changed him almost the way that Arles changed Vincent van Gogh. Sometimes a place changes an artist. And this fantastic painting, Red Sails, I got to see it at the Hana Ranch Hotel before they sold it, and they also sold the paintings. That was really, really bold to do that primary color scheme. And it hit me when I was preparing for this lecture 10 years ago, when I gave another version of this. I thought, that is very, very close to the Armenian flag. So was that conscious or unconscious? I don't know, but you can see a connection between the two. Here, kind of an Adam and Eve with an element of exoticism and seduction mixed into it. A scene from the Hawaiians greeting Captain Cook. And the man who owned this painting, he's a grandson of Paul Fagan, says his family is very, very puzzled by the blue backs. Why did he give anyone, a blue color back? But Manookian liked to say that he wanted to create a symphony of color. Maybe he was, much more interested in color than anything else, and that gave him some freedom. And the painting that is on the cover of the presentation and the cover of the book. One of his great paintings, where you can just see the way he takes you into that voyage on the outrigger and makes you feel like you are, right behind them, maybe pushing off from the shore. Beautiful, beautiful drawing, and such a great composition. This was not one of the Green Mill paintings, but the Damons later went back and bought other paintings. This is in, I can't do it from memory. This is in a very fancy hotel. I can tell you the name later. This is one of the Manookians that's now in public, inspired by a Japanese screen. And in 1929, Manookian had a show at Gump's Gallery. You may know that Gump's was an importer of Asian goods that was in San Francisco and also in Hawaii. So it was a very high-placed location for a show. So you had a one-man show there and showed images like these that had a certain glamour. If you want to call Manookian a little bit kitschy, I think that's fair. There is a connection between what he was doing and kind of the poster version of Hawaii that other artists were generating. This is the last Manookian painting that showed up. Now that I've published about Manookian, every now and then I get an email out of the blue, something shows up. This one showed up about 7 years ago. I had a woman contacted me and then I put her in touch with an art dealer, but she told me that her mother had, I'm not sure if it was her mother or grandmother, a relative had rented a room to Manookian. And it sounds like he was a boarder. He lived in a lot of different places. And anyways, he had rented a room, and at one time he had a tantrum. He just had a big blowout, and she heard it. She came downstairs and calmed him down, and he apologized after he calmed down. And he took this painting from behind the dresser, and where it had been kind of fallen, it had fallen off the easel, and he gave it to her as a gift. And that's how it was in their family. This is from the Campbell family, a Manookian that's been torn in half. He apparently had another tantrum. He had a blowout at a public opening of his own work and tore this painting in half. And from what I've heard, definitely on a few occasions he was a binge alcoholic. And a Jackson Pollock-like figure, really temperamental and sensitive. Apparently he liked to get into it with people. When he thought people were not knowledgeable about art, look out, right? Here's one of his 1930 images, that brilliant color of a yellow sky, showing a Japanese style home on the cover of Paradise the Pacific. Just so lovely. His career continued, and I want to say something now about 1930. I have some paintings from 1930. You know that the stock market crash was October of 1929. And what I've been told is that the crash came slowly to Hawaii. That at first it didn't affect people, it didn't affect tourism too much, but over maybe 6 months or a year, it began to affect the economy there, and began to be a problem. So one of the things that Manookian may have been dealing with at the end of his life was that he was building this art career. He'd left the newspaper, trying to support himself, and he may have seen that, leaving his grip because of the stock market crash. Painting The Fisherman from 1930. Hawaiians making poi. Wonderful kind of a mural treatment there. I mean, very, very stiff, and yet very, very decorative. Look at the flame tree, and the glances, the eyes of the figures all going in different directions. I don't have, this is in such good focus, but this is in France. This is one of the very few things that his relatives in France owned. I'll tell you later how a few things came to France after his death, but it looks like a scene of Hawaiian royalty in pastel. There were a lot of, you can imagine, native Hawaiians who hadn't quite given in to modernity, and those were some of the people he liked to sketch, including this shamaness, who he sketched as Pele, the goddess of fire. Fantastic, giant tropical flower hanging above a sleeping figure. And one bit of research that was really, kind of wonderful but kind of frustrating, I came across this name Verna Tallman. I was going through old newspaper clippings, and I found that she lived in Napa, California. And I located her estate, and she had died 3 months before. So, but her niece told me a lot about Verna. Verna was a woman educated at Berkeley who went to work at the Bishop Museum, also was a painter and who knew Manookian, and even told some people, that they had a relationship. So, we don't know, but she used to talk about that. I also understand that Verna was a little bit eccentric, like some artists are. She was a little bit off he was a little bit off. But you can see his painting of a woman weaving, which I found in Napa, and then we got that donated to the Honolulu Academy, and then a painting that Verna did that was in her estate of the same woman. So they were painting together, painting the same kind of subjects. And Manookian had really made a shift to painting, scenes of Hawaiian life that said something maybe a little more honest or a little more real about Hawaii. And when you look at the photos of Hawaiians of that period in the canneries, you kind of see what he was attempting to capture. This showed up on Antiques Roadshow. If you watch that show, or you can see the video of this on YouTube, tiny, tiny little mural study that goes into an arch. I think that was probably for the Waipahu Theater. And if you visit the Waipahu Theater today, they have put that heavy kind of linen cloth glued to all the walls years and years and years ago, maybe when it became an adult theater for a while. Now it's a church. But, so nobody knows if Manookian's original murals are still underneath the cloth on these walls, but his last major commission was to paint the interior of this theater. And just to tell you something kind of touching, Manookian's sister-in-law was still alive when my first research started. She was elderly, but still alive. And she brought a model or a maquette of the Waipahu Theater to a meeting with my friend in France who interviewed her. And she said, "This is the Honolulu Opera House, and Arman did the murals." And of course, my friend didn't correct her, because she thought of him having done the murals for the Opera House. The last painting installed, I think, is kind of a sad painting, because it's not one of his best paintings, but it's also a painting that seems to be about maybe departure, is this painting of flamingos. It was found out with the trash in the 1950s by somebody who recognized what it was and grabbed it, and now it's been restored in a very, very nice frame. The color has oxidized a little bit. I think it was brighter originally. But apparently, toward the very, very end of his life, Manookian was staying out at Black Point, which is one of the distinctive beaches there in Honolulu. And he spent a lot of time with John Kelly, his old newspaper friend, and they sketched together, which you can see here in this late sketch. And when I traveled to Hawaii for the final part of my research on Manookian, the house where he died was for sale. And so I did the bold thing. I called the realtor and I said, I'd like to see the house. And I caused a problem, because when someone has committed suicide in a house, you have to report that to potential buyers. So the sale went through, but I kind of almost messed things up. But and then it's been completely redone since. The house doesn't look like this. I caught the last of it. But Manookian was living in that little room downstairs behind the screen door, and it had a door to the kitchen. And he was living with a man named Cyril Lemon, who was an amateur painter and also an architect. And he had a fiancée named Belinda, although they did not marry later. And it was a house where people drank a lot and partied a lot. There was a lot going on. And the story goes that one night, this sounds incredible, but it's what I've heard, that Cyril Lemon and his friends, there's Cyril Lemon later, were playing murder in the parlor. Doesn't that sound like it's from a board game? They were playing murder in the parlor, and they heard a sound, and it was Manookian falling onto the kitchen floor. And it sounds like he drank photo developer, because Lemon was also a photographer. So we think Cyril Lemon, because his daughter had this, took this last photo of Manookian, and it may have been developed with the chemical that he took to kill himself. And there's maybe the possibility too that if people are drinking, maybe he drank it by accident. One never knows. But at the age of 27, he died very shortly in the hospital after they found him. And when I toured the house, the door to the kitchen had been boarded up, many, many years before. So there was a memorial exhibition in 1933, and you can see that Verna Tallman's painting was there in the memorial exhibition. His friends honored him. And among the Hawaii artistic community, they really admired him. They really thought he was one of the most amazing artists in Hawaii. He had a lot of friends. He had a lot of admirers. He had some other patrons besides Mrs. Damon and Mrs. Fagan. And this is part of an obituary, or part of a tribute that appeared in the Star Bulletin that Arthur Green wrote, trying to describe him. I'll read that to you. He was shy and sensitive, at times defiant of convention. Yet to those in whom he had great confidence, he could be genial, entertaining, even witty in an ironic, satiric vein. He was always more or less a puzzle, even to those with whom he most associated. And I'm going to just kind of fill in the blank there and just say I think what he experienced as a young man, what he saw, would have filled in a lot of that puzzle. Another quote, Manookian was chiefly a colorist. His was the dream of creating in color a great symphony of beauty. He would do in color what Beethoven had done in music. This was the dream of this anarchic youth. But wait, there's more. There's one more quote that I think I love the most of all. This was something, this I found very, very late in my research, but this is something that a friend read at his memorial service, and it's quite incredible. So, last reading, and then I'm going to go to spontaneous again. Art springs from the wild and anarchic side of human nature. Between the artist and the bureaucrat, there must always be a profound mutual antagonism, an age-long battle in which the artist, always outwardly worsted, wins in the end through the gratitude of mankind for the joy he puts into their lives. That's from the notebooks of Bertrand Russell, and I just think that's extraordinary. What a tribute. So Cyril Lemon went to Europe and took one oil painting and a few other things to the family. Manookian had a large library. I think he also took some of the books. He loved Flaubert. He loved all the French authors, read in French. And there's Manookian's brother Vahe and his sister Adrienne. His mother was still alive and could never understand or come to terms with her son's suicide. I mean, who could? You know, so far away, why didn't he come home? Why didn't he rely on family? You know, so much, tragedy that was there. A very, very cool thing that came from the research, after this got published in Honolulu Magazine, a friend let me know about this in 2009, Hawaii became one of the first states, in fact it may have been the first state, to recognize April 24th as a day of remembrance for the genocide. And in the resolution, you can see this, there's a whereas. Whereas Armenia's ties to Hawaii started in the 1920s with the gifted painter Arman Manookian, a genocide survivor who lived in Hawaii for almost 6 years before his tragic death in 1931, and who became known as Hawaii's Van Gogh. So that was in the resolution, and I think that came from the research, and it's a wonderful thing to have that happen. So a little bit more, you're probably wondering, can you see Manookians? Where can you find them? Have they been exhibited? I have counted 30 oil paintings and 7 or 8 gouaches. So that's a very, very small amount of work. I'd like to think some more things are going to show up. And with the internet, maybe I'll get an email one of these days, but things show up from time to time. Only 30 paintings. There were 3 of them. There were 3 of the Green Mill green paintings, the grill paintings on view in 2014 in a show called Art Deco Hawaii. So here they are. And other than that, there's a lady in San Diego who's not answering my email that has one. There's a lady in Honolulu with one painting that I know of that I could be in touch with. But why hasn't there been a big Manookian show? There are just a few of them, and they're in private collections, and they are far away. And that's, of course, another reason that the only reason you're going to hear about them is you come to my PowerPoint. But I'd like to open it up for questions, and thank you for your interest in Arman Manookian. I'd like to hear your reactions and questions. What's coming to mind after, taking that trip with me? Louise?
I'm just amazed at the shift from those early illustrations to suddenly this kind of really developed sense of color and sense of abstraction. Like, whoa, how did he, there's a middle period, or he was so young, so he just must have been blown away when he got to Hawaii.
You know what someone said to me that, to me, puts it in the framework? Someone once said that a great work of art or a great piece of music, a great thing, makes you happy and sad at the same time. Mm-hmm. And his work really, Van Gogh has that. Manookian really, really has that. They are gorgeous. I think in Hawaii, the happy side really happened. He really did think he was in paradise, but he was a deeply sad person. And so both kinds of feelings are there in the work, and I think it powers the emotional side of the work. That's why I became an artist, not just an illustrator.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of those paintings have a kind of almost Fauvist quality to them. And I just wonder if did he study other painting, or is he a guy that's just kind of there doing completely his own thing and inventing his own way without a lot of attachment to other European painting or anybody else's painting?
I think he'd seen a lot. There's holes in the research, but his family, they had business in Egypt. He'd been to Egypt. He had been to Paris. We know he spent time in New York at the Art Students League, and would you go to New York without seeing a few museums? So I think he was, sophisticated through seeing a lot of modern art, and that definitely influenced what he did. It's there.
Do you know if he maybe also, or if someone like Paul Jacquelet had any idea that he existed as a painter when he was doing his prints and paintings of Polynesia, Hawaii, Micronesia?
Who's the person?
Paul Jacquelet.
I don't know who that is.
He's a famous printmaker. He's French, but he grew up in Japan.
Okay.
And he traveled all over Micronesia, Polynesia, Hawaii, doing basically Japanese-style prints of kind of modern day world. And some of them, look a little bit like Jacquelet's things look like his works.
Got it. Well, I think there's always an exchange between artists, and something I do know. You look at the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were all kinds of, Germans and Scandinavians and Dutch in Bali and Polynesia, and, there were more Gauguins than just Gauguin. So this idea of, using the exotic as your subject matter shows up in a century of art, at the very least. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that thorough and sensitive research. It was really so well done. And it sounds like it just continues, since you're still waiting for people to contact you.
Well, it's just, I'm retired now. And I was telling a friend, retired just means you have more time to do the things you
That's
want.
right.
I made a decision recently, and I'm telling people because I have to follow up, I'm going to try and write a fictionalized version of Manookian's life. And I give myself 10 years because I don't want to rush. And I have a lot of research to do. And I don't know if you noticed that I'm not Armenian. So I'm going to have to depend on friends, my brother-in-law, his family to help me. But I think that's going to be a way of continuing the research, is to try and write a fictional version of his life.
So I'd like to add a couple of things then, since you said
Of course,
that, right?
of course.
So it's so interesting because when you start out where he comes from, my family is from what was Constantinople, and from that period I found my ancestors' clothing. So I could understand this curiosity and research, even though it's my family versus that's not yours. But I just think they were also Protestant, and all the people in Constantinople knew each other back then. So it's just interesting for me. They probably knew each other, my great-grandmother and their family. So that's one thing. And the other thing that comes up for me is that the sad painting, the one of the flamingos, you know what it makes me think of? I thought it was sad too the minute I saw it, and I thought, he's going home.
Yeah, I think it shows
Because
up.
they kind of look like storks. And when I was in Istanbul, like outside of Istanbul, they have storks. Like I almost thought they were imaginary. Like you hear about the stork bringing the baby. Well, when I went to near Izmir, into a little village, they had storks living on the top of the telephone poles and big nests. And so it was so interesting, that's what I thought of. And since he was from a wealthy family, back then, they would always leave for the summer to go somewhere.
Right.
Very rarely did families in Istanbul who had money stay in Istanbul in the summer. They always went away. So, that's what it made me think.
It opens up a great set of connections for you. It's always an education,
but also for you to know that there were certain habits that they had, those families that lived there up until he was 11.
Well, I'm looking for things to read, and I'm reading a memoir now called, I think it's The Gardens of Silifan, which is a young woman who was 19th century Constantinople, and I'm going to try to read enough that some of these ways of living make their way into what I'm going to try and write.
Absolutely. It's exciting.
Yeah, and you know, here's the pitch. The pitch is, I do have a book about Manookian. It's really a pamphlet, but I'll dignify it by calling it a book, and it has all the known paintings. And when we're done asking questions, I have them on the back table for $25 if you would like a souvenir, you know, to look at the paintings or to show your family. John?
I have a couple of nuts and bolts questions. One, so the first gentleman who commissioned you to do the research, what was how did he discover Manookian? And then are you the first sort of contemporary, 21st century guy to piece the paintings together and really figure out where things are?
The connection is that my friend, his name is Sheldon Geringer, and 25 years later, we are still working together, all from that painting I bought, at the antique store. He was a submarine commander, and he was stationed at Pearl Harbor, and he has many friends in the military. So he heard about the McClellan estate, of Edmund McClellan through a military friend, and bought some of the illustrations Manookian had made for the Marine Corps history. It was never published. So he had those, and that was one of the reasons he commissioned the research. And there was a reporter, there was a guy named Ron Ronk, who in the 1990s tried to do research about Manookian, and he wrote a pretty good feature article for one of the local papers, but he never broke through to Europe. He never found the family in Europe, and that's where Google was magic. I think this is a Google era research story, and at one point, a year after this happened, somebody from Google contacted me, and they said that they had this up on their wall. They had like a wall of research things that had come from Google, and someone told them about this, and they had it on the wall of one of their headquarters as a breakthrough that had come from their search engine. But that whole thing of, you call someone, we haven't talked about my uncle for decades. How'd you get my cell phone number? That's the internet era. Only now. Deborah?
What was his relationship like with other Hawaiian artists? Did other Hawaiian artists, were they doing similar work like him, or was it, to me they were very Matissean, colorful, which is a period, which makes sense. And then, did he have any other Armenian friends in Hawaii?
I don't know of any other Armenians. I think George Gerasimos, the Greek, was maybe as close as he came. There was a Hawaiian Artists Association, and I've seen the roster. It was a very, very small roster. But there were other artists who were maybe close. One is Madge Tennant, who has a little museum now in Honolulu. So there were some other modern artists, but he had the boldest color of the modern artists. And maybe the artist he was maybe the closest to in appearance was that his paintings looked like John Kelly's paintings, and his drawings looked a little bit like Don Blanding, kind of that, Art Deco look. So he both stood out, but was also part of a period, definitely.
Is there like a memorial? Like, where is he buried? Is there a memorial or something about
I never was able to find that out. I don't know where he was buried. I did get, like I say, I got a kind of a script of his memorial that somebody sent me. It was found in Texas. Yeah, poignant story. Yeah.
How did he get the name Theodore as a middle name? Do you have any idea? Because that's not a traditionally Armenian name, so I'm assuming that was it. I don't know.
Well, what Tadeos, isn't it? Tadeos would be like an early evangelist.
It is.
Yeah. So his given name was Tadeos Manookian.
Yeah.
And I think, and this is where Armenians, please help me out. Arman was maybe almost an Ellis Island way of saying Armenian, I think. Or does it have another?
No,
Does
it's
it have
Admen.
Say again?
Maybe Admen is Armenian,
Okay.
but I don't know about Adnan. It could be. It's so similar.
If somebody finds an answer, email that to me because I'd be curious. Well, listen, I think everybody probably needs to stretch out. I'll hang out around the back and we can chat. There's wonderful cookies and refreshments out in the lobby. And thank you again for your interest.
Thank you.